Imagine the sound of laughter, the high-pitched giggle that defined countless childhoods, suddenly interrupted by headlines you never expected to read. The story of Kevin Clash, the man behind Elmo's joyful voice, became something far more complicated than puppets in children's television. His rise and sudden fall remind you that even the most innocent symbols of joy can be shadowed by allegations that alter everything. Before the story can even begin, it's essential to be clear. Kevin Clash was never convicted of any crime. Allegations were made, lawsuits were filed, but all of them were dismissed due to statutes of limitations. The courts never ruled on guilt or innocence, leaving a legacy built on children's laughter tangled forever with public suspicion. This is the atmosphere in which the scandal unfolded. The warmth of Sesame Street collided with the chill of scandal sheets. Welcome to 102 Hours, where you lean back, close your eyes, and let the world of true crime and mystery unfold in an ASMR cadence. Tonight, the lights are dim, and we're stepping backstage, not into a haunted house or a crime scene, but into the soft felt and bright colors of Sesame Street. You picture rows of toys in a store window, Elmo dolls blinking cheerfully, their voices echoing endlessly. Elmo loves you, and then you remember, behind that voice was a single man, Kevin Clash, who suddenly became the subject of allegations that ended a career in the most public way possible. As you listen, let your breath slow down. Let the room feel smaller, calmer, almost like sitting in a theater after the curtains close. Before we go further, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop your location and local time in the comments. It helps this channel grow and tells me where in the world you're listening, tucked into your own corner of the night. Kevin Clash's story doesn't begin in controversy. It begins decades earlier in Baltimore, Maryland. Born in 1960, Clash grew up fascinated with puppetry, creating characters out of scraps of fabric and cardboard. That early spark would lead him to television, first on local shows, and eventually to Sesame Street, where he transformed Elmo from a secondary puppet into one of the most beloved children's characters in history. By the late 1980s, Elmo wasn't just a character, he was a phenomenon. Tickle Me Elmo became a global toy craze in 1996, selling out so quickly it sparked shopping frenzies. Elmo visited presidents, sang with pop stars, and taught children the alphabet in dozens of languages. That giggling voice, high-pitched and innocent, came from Clash's vocal cords, crafted in a way that children instantly trusted. But trust is fragile, and by November 2012, that same voice was tied not to a puppet, but to scandalous headlines. The first public allegation came from Sheldon Stevens, a young man who claimed he had a sexual relationship with Clash when he was underage. The claim was denied by Clash, who admitted they had been involved but only as consenting adults. Sesame Workshop announced it had investigated and found the claim unsubstantiated. But the accusation was enough to ignite a firestorm. Here is where the contrast sharpens. Just a month before, Clash had been praised as a genius in the documentary Being Elmo, A Puppeteer's Journey. It was a tender portrayal of a man whose art changed the lives of millions of children. Suddenly, that film looked different, like a smiling portrait with cracks across the canvas. The quirky detail here is that Clash himself had said during the film's release that puppets allow you to say things people don't expect. It was meant as a whimsical statement about artistry, but in the shadow of allegations, it rang in the public's ear with unintended weight. The mainstream fact remains. Sesame Street had been a symbol of learning and innocence since its debut in 1969, praised by educators worldwide. To see the name of its leading puppeteer paired with sexual misconduct headlines felt almost unthinkable. Investigators still question whether the timing of the claims, surfacing decades later, meant vital evidence and testimony were lost forever. Without a conviction, without a legal finding, the story sits in limbo, and that limbo itself is where the scandal lives. For Clash, the fallout began immediately. Reporters camped outside, social media exploded, and parents who once laughed with their toddlers through Elmo's giggle now asked questions no one wanted to answer. Was this simply a case of accusations too late to pursue? Or had the voice of Elmo been hiding something darker? The truth remains unclear, and yet the shadow over Clash's legacy is undeniable. As you sit with that thought, you picture the paradox. A red, furry puppet who taught kindness, counting, and sharing, forever tied to allegations against the man who brought him to life. It is this contradiction, the joy of a character and the controversy of its creator, that sets the stage for everything that follows. The story shifts back in time away from the swirl of headlines and back into a childhood bedroom in Baltimore, Maryland, where fabric scraps, bits of felt, and homemade characters came to life in the hands of a boy who couldn't stop imagining. Kevin Clash was born in 1960, and from an early age you picture him crouched over scissors and thread, stitching together puppets instead of playing outside. He was the kind of kid who cut up his father E.S. trench coat to build his first real puppet, a decision that would have gotten most kids grounded for months. Instead, his parents encouraged his fascination, allowing him to see the potential in old clothes and mismatched fabrics. For Clash, these weren't just toys. They were the start of a voice, a performance, and eventually, a career. By the late 1970s, Clash's talent had already begun to reach beyond Baltimore. He appeared on local children's shows like Captain Kangaroo, and later found his way into Jim Henson's wider circle of performers. It was a golden age for puppetry, and Clash's energy stood out. Puppetry is an art of duality. One hand hidden, one voice disguised, but a personality fully on display. Clash excelled at making you forget the man behind the puppet. This skill earned him a spot on Sesame Street, where by 1984, he would inherit a red puppet originally intended as a background character. That puppet, Elmo, was waiting for the right voice, the right spark. Clash provided it. The historical fact is clear. Elmo became one of Sesame Street's greatest stars. By the mid-1990s, Elmo's segments, Elmo's World, were watched by millions of children daily, and the Tickle Me Elmo craze of 1996 turned the character into a household name. Parents lined up at stores before dawn, desperate to get the doll before shelves went empty. Clash had not just found a voice, he had created a phenomenon. Children laughed, hugged, and even trusted Elmo as if he were real, not a puppet. Yet behind this rise was also a personal journey. The quirky detail here is that Clash often described his process in terms of empathy. He once said he thought of how a child feels when creating Elmo's reactions. Tiny shoulders shrugging, wide eyes blinking with curiosity. He even experimented with deliberately mispronouncing words in Elmo's voice, because he believed that made children feel safe in their own mistakes. That attention to emotional nuance made his character different, softer, and more magnetic. And yet, the private life of the puppeteer remained largely hidden. For years, Clash balanced public appearances with quiet privacy, rarely speaking about himself beyond professional anecdotes. It wasn't until 2006 that his autobiography, My Life as a Furry Red Monster, revealed more personal reflections about his journey. The book was celebratory, filled with inspiration, but gave little clue of the controversies that would one day dominate headlines. Investigators still question whether the aura of perfection surrounding Clash and Elmo created blind spots in how media and audiences perceived him. After all, it's hard to imagine darker allegations about someone who brought joy to millions of children, which may be why the shock was so great when accusations eventually surfaced. At this stage of the story, though, the world only saw a prodigy who had climbed from a Baltimore bedroom to the global stage, reshaping children's television along the way. You think of this part of the story as the moment before the storm. The applause is loud, the documentary cameras are rolling, and Clash seems untouchable. In truth, though, the very duality of puppetry, hiding behind a voice, creating a persona larger than yourself, foreshadowed the contradictions that would later haunt him. For now, the prodigy is still rising, unaware that the same fame that lifted him so high would later magnify every allegation and every whisper that followed. Step with me now into the quiet halls of the Sesame Workshop Studios in New York, the place where dreams in felt and foam are sewn together daily. You picture a maze of sets: Big Bird's Nest, Oscar's Trash Can, and Elmo's brightly colored world. For millions of children, these places feel real. For Kevin Clash, they were his workplace, the stage where his artistry thrived. Behind the curtain, though, life was less about magic and more about the grueling mechanics of keeping a global children's show alive. Long hours, endless rehearsals, and the pressure of maintaining a beloved character weighed on every puppeteer. By the 1990s, Clash wasn't just the man behind Elmo. He was a central creative force at Sesame Workshop. He trained younger puppeteers, consulted on international versions of the show, and became a de facto ambassador of Sesame Street across the globe. The mainstream fact here is that Sesame Street had by then aired in over 120 countries, making it one of the most influential educational programs in television history. Clash's work traveled far beyond American children. His voice resonated through characters in multiple languages, introducing empathy, counting, and kindness worldwide. What people rarely saw, however, was the backstage grind. Puppeteering isn't glamorous, the quirky tidbit you might not know. Puppeteers often spend hours crouched on their knees, arms extended painfully above their heads, just to bring a character to life on camera. Clash described this as puppet yoga, a physical endurance challenge that few outsiders could understand. In rehearsals, mirrors lined the sets so performers could see the puppets, not themselves, making the art about invisibility rather than fame. For Clash, invisibility was both a professional necessity and, as it turned out, a deeply personal habit. Behind those curtains, Clash was navigating his private identity. His sexuality wasn't something he openly discussed during most of his career, largely because children's entertainment carried an expectation of innocence and neutrality. In the early 2000s, even as attitudes toward LGBTQ+ representation were shifting, performers in family entertainment felt the weight of public scrutiny more acutely. Clash did eventually come out, but only after his career was already under fire from allegations. This silence, chosen or imposed, created layers between the public Kevin and the private one. Investigators still question whether this guarded personal life made him more vulnerable when accusations surfaced. Without a long public record of personal openness, it became easier for speculation to fill the silence. Sesame Workshop, for its part, consistently emphasized that the show's mission was larger than any single performer. Yet, even inside the organization, colleagues later admitted that the allegations struck painfully close to home, given the trust parents placed in their brand. To understand the pressure Clash carried, you think of the paradox. He was at once invisible and world-famous. Children didn't know his face, but they knew his voice intimately. He walked the streets without recognition, yet his character appeared on talk shows, late-night comedy, and even at the White House. In 2010, Elmo sang with Michelle Obama about healthy eating. Clash stood just a few feet away, unseen, arm raised, voice high, embodying joy for millions watching. It was a surreal duality, anonymity mixed with global influence. Backstage at Sesame Street, colleagues admired his precision, his mentorship, and his ability to bring levity to long filming days. But there was also a sense, even then, that Clash lived two lives: the open-hearted performer who gave voice to love and curiosity, and the man who kept much of himself hidden. That tension would grow sharper as the years passed, preparing the stage for the allegations that would soon define his name more than the character he helped create. It was November 2012 when the first headline appeared, and suddenly the man behind Elmo's cheerful giggle was at the center of a scandal that parents didn't want to explain to their children. The allegation came from Sheldon Stevens, a 23-year-old model and aspiring actor who claimed he had been in a sexual relationship with Kevin Clash that began when Stevens was just 16. The accusation landed like a thunderclap. For decades, Elmo had been one of the most trusted figures in children's entertainment, and now the name Kevin Clash appeared alongside phrases like sexual misconduct and underage. Even if Clash denied wrongdoing, even if nothing had yet been proven, the mere association was enough to send shockwaves through Sesame Workshop and the wider media world. Clash acknowledged he had been in a relationship with Stevens, but insisted it began when Stevens was of legal age. Sesame Workshop quickly announced it had conducted its own inquiry and found the allegation unsubstantiated. Yet once the story had broken, the genie couldn't be put back into the bottle. In an era where online news cycles could spin reputations into dust overnight, the story spread faster than any carefully worded statement could contain. The mainstream fact here is that Stevens initially recanted his claims as part of a settlement agreement, only to later reaffirm them, creating a confusing narrative that left the public unsure which version to believe. The quirky detail in this storm is almost too strange. While the headlines were erupting, shelves in toy stores were still stocked with Tickle Me Elmo dolls, programmed to laugh endlessly when squeezed. Shoppers described the surreal feeling of hearing Elmo's giggle echoing in aisles at the very moment the puppeteer behind it was under siege in the press. The character kept laughing while the man who gave him voice was fighting for his professional life. Investigators still question whether Stevens' shifting statements were the product of legal pressure, financial agreements, or personal turmoil. The timeline remains tangled. First an allegation, then a retraction, then a renewal of the original claim. For Clash, the damage was already irreversible. Sesame Workshop, while careful in its language, acknowledged the situation had become a distraction from the show's mission. In the world of children's programming, distraction is enough to topple even the most established careers. The scandal played out against the backdrop of a media hungry for contradictions. On one hand, Clash was fresh from the glow of being Elmo, a puppeteer's journey, a 2011 documentary that had painted him as a creative genius and gentle mentor. On the other hand, he was now portrayed as a man with a shadowy personal life, accused of exploiting a minor. The juxtaposition was irresistible for headlines, but agonizing for everyone involved. Parents who had trusted Elmo as a safe figure in their homes were left questioning whether innocence had ever truly been part of the story. What made the first allegation so powerful wasn't just the claim itself. It was the rupture of trust. The name Kevin Clash had never been widely known outside puppetry circles. Elmo, though, was everywhere. On lunchboxes, in children's arms at bedtime, smiling from TV screens. Suddenly, the invisible puppeteer was visible, and not for the reasons anyone expected. For Clash, the carefully constructed boundary between his private identity and public character crumbled in a matter of days. As you let this sink in, the irony is hard to miss. Elmo, a character built on the language of love, friendship, and kindness, was now forever linked with a story about betrayal, secrecy, and controversy. Whether or not the first allegation could stand in court, its impact had already taken hold. Kevin Clash was no longer just the man behind a puppet. He was now the man accused, and nothing would ever be the same again. When the first allegation surfaced in November 2012, Sesame Workshop found itself staring into a crisis unlike anything it had faced in its long history. This was the organization that had been built on the pillars of education, trust, and childlike wonder since its debut in 1969. Suddenly, the name Kevin Clash, one of its most celebrated creative forces, was inextricably tied to accusations of misconduct with a minor. The leadership at Sesame Workshop knew every word of their response would be scrutinized by parents, by the press, and by decades of loyal viewers who had invited Elmo into their homes. Their first move was a public statement. Sesame Workshop confirmed that it had previously investigated the allegation and found it to be unsubstantiated. They stood by that conclusion while also emphasizing the seriousness with which they took the claim. The mainstream fact is that the organization was legally bound to protect its brand and mission, but morally, it was also tethered to the trust of families worldwide. The balance was precarious. Defend Clash too strongly, and they risked looking like they were protecting him over children. Cut him loose too quickly, and they risked appearing to abandon a longtime contributor without due process. Inside the organization, the mood was grim. Staffers, many of whom had worked with Clash for decades, were shocked and divided. Some insisted that the allegations did not match the man they knew, while others worried that even a shadow of impropriety could stain the legacy of Sesame Street forever. The quirky tidbit here is that in the days following the first headline, parents began calling Sesame Workshop's offices, not with legal threats, but with desperate questions like, "Do I need to tell my toddler Elmo did something wrong?" The very idea that a beloved puppet could be associated with scandal left families scrambling for explanations that small children could understand. Investigators still question whether Sesame Workshop had acted swiftly enough when the allegation was first raised internally. Critics argue that by handling the matter privately before it became public, the organization may have unintentionally fueled suspicion once the story broke. Transparency, after all, is the currency of trust in the modern media age. To many parents, the revelation that Sesame Workshop had known about the claim earlier felt like a betrayal, even if their internal investigation had cleared Clash. Externally, the press demanded answers. Every interview with Sesame Workshop executives became a careful exercise in damage control. They emphasized that Elmo, the character, remained larger than any single performer, and that Sesame Street's mission was unchanged. But behind the scenes, they also understood the practical nightmare unfolding. Kevin Clash was not just a voice actor who could be swapped out. He was the architect of Elmo's mannerisms, expressions, and rhythms. Replacing him would not be seamless. It was like asking someone else to play Mozart mid-performance, hoping the audience wouldn't notice. And yet, the organization had no choice but to prepare for that possibility. In quiet rehearsals, other puppeteers began practicing Elmo's voice, refining the giggle, the falsetto, the slight pauses that made the character so convincing. It was damage control disguised as training, a contingency plan for the future. Few outside the studio walls knew this was happening, but it spoke volumes about how uncertain Clash's future had suddenly become. For Sesame Workshop, the crisis was not only about one man, it was about safeguarding a cultural institution. The very essence of Sesame Street was to give children a safe space to learn, laugh, and grow. Now, that safe space was being tested by adult realities. The organization's official statements reassured the public that children's programming remained their focus, but internally, the realization was sinking in. Elmo would never again be just Elmo. From this point forward, the puppet carried with it the shadow of the puppeteer's scandal. You sit with that thought and picture a boardroom filled with executives, the walls lined with posters of Big Bird, Cookie Monster, and Elmo smiling brightly. Those paper smiles seemed almost mocking in the tense air. The leaders of Sesame Workshop were not just managing a public relations crisis, they were trying to preserve the innocence of childhood against the backdrop of adult allegations. In that room, decisions about press releases and legal language carried the weight of millions of children's trust. The response, careful and measured, could not erase the fact that a beloved institution had been dragged into scandal. Even with Clash still working behind the scenes, the tide was turning, and the possibility of his resignation loomed closer every day. If the first allegation in 2012 cracked the foundation of Kevin Clash's career, the second, and then the third, threatened to bring the entire structure down. Within days of Sheldon Stevens' claims surfacing, another man, Cecil Singleton, stepped forward. He alleged that as a teenager in the mid-1980s, he had been lured into a sexual relationship with Clash when he was only 15 years old. Singleton's lawsuit sought millions in damages, and unlike Stevens' shifting statements, his account remained steady in court filings and interviews. The emergence of another accuser shifted the story from a single controversy into a pattern, at least in the eyes of the public. And then more voices followed. By the end of November 2012, 3 lawsuits had been filed against Clash, each from men who claimed they were underage when they had sexual encounters with him. The mainstream fact is that these suits never resulted in convictions. Judges dismissed them on the grounds of New York's statute of limitations, which required such claims to be filed within a specific number of years. Legally, Clash walked away cleared, but the accusations themselves piled up in the headlines like bricks in a wall he could never climb over. For the public, it didn't matter that the courts never weighed in on the merits of the claims. The appearance of multiple allegations made the situation far harder to dismiss. Suddenly, Clash wasn't just one man denying a single accusation, he was facing a chorus of accusers, each reinforcing the perception of impropriety. Sesame Workshop, which had initially stood by his work, now found itself unable to keep Elmo's puppeteer separate from the scandal swirling around him. The quirky detail that floated up during this period almost seemed surreal. While lawsuits were being filed against Clash, Elmo appeared on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, cheerfully singing holiday songs with Mariah Carey. The juxtaposition was bizarre. On one channel, news anchors dissected allegations of misconduct. On another, Elmo was spreading holiday cheer to millions. The puppet's perpetual innocence clashed directly with the growing narrative about its puppeteer. Investigators still question whether the clustering of these lawsuits, emerging in quick succession, was coincidence or the result of one allegation emboldening others to come forward. Attorneys for the accusers argued that the consistency in the stories pointed to credibility, while Clash's legal team countered that the timing suggested opportunism. Without trials, the question of truth remained unresolved, and in that unresolved space, public suspicion thrived. What became clear, though, was that Kevin Clash's career at Sesame Workshop was unsalvageable. With each new allegation, the pressure on the organization intensified. Parents, sponsors, and even political figures questioned whether a man under such scrutiny should continue performing for children. Clash himself released a statement saying the allegations had become a distraction from the show's mission, a carefully worded admission that his presence was now a liability. The ripple effect extended beyond Sesame Street. Puppetry, a niche but proud art form, found itself dragged into tabloid columns. Colleagues feared the headlines would stain the credibility of their craft, reducing decades of artistry to a single scandal. In interviews, veteran puppeteers spoke about the sadness of watching one of their brightest stars unravel under public scrutiny. For them, it wasn't just about Elmo. It was about an art form that suddenly felt vulnerable in the harsh glare of scandal. By the close of 2012, Clash was no longer just a puppeteer with one accusation to his name. He was a man at the center of multiple lawsuits, a public figure whose fall from grace was unfolding in real time. The allegations multiplied, and even if the courts would later dismiss them, the damage was already done. In the court of public opinion, more voices meant more doubt, and more doubt meant the end of Kevin Clash's era with Elmo. On November 20th, 2012, the announcement finally came. Kevin Clash, the man who had given Elmo his laughter and his warmth for nearly 3 decades, was resigning from Sesame Workshop. His departure was framed in a brief, almost clinical press release. The allegations against him, it stated, had become too much of a distraction from the show's mission to educate and entertain children. Behind those words, however, was the undeniable reality that one of Sesame Street's most important figures had been forced out under the weight of scandal. For Clash, the resignation was a devastating blow. He had spent 30 years climbing from local television in Baltimore to international fame, and now, in a single statement, it was all gone. There was no farewell episode, no chance for him to say goodbye through the character that had defined him. Instead, Elmo continued on without him, voiced by other puppeteers who had trained under his guidance. The puppet never broke stride, never acknowledged the change because Elmo was bigger than any one performer. That, perhaps, was the hardest truth for Clash to accept. In the weeks leading up to his resignation, Clash had remained silent in public, issuing only short written denials through his attorneys. He did not sit for interviews, nor did he appear on camera to defend himself. The silence left room for speculation, and in that vacuum, the narrative was written by others. By reporters, by lawyers, by critics, and by accusers. When he did speak, it was in measured tones. Personal matters have diverted attention away from the important work Sesame Street is doing. His statement read, "I cannot allow this to go on any longer, and I am deeply sorry to leave." It was dignified, perhaps even noble, but it carried the finality of defeat. For Sesame Workshop, the resignation was damage control. The brand's reputation was everything, built on trust between parents and a program that had shaped generations of children. Allowing one of its stars to remain under a cloud of scandal risked unraveling decades of goodwill. Executives moved quickly to reassure the public that Sesame Street's integrity remained intact, emphasizing that Elmo would continue, unchanged as a beloved character. But behind the scenes, staff who had worked closely with Clash reportedly felt both sorrow and shock. He wasn't just a colleague, he had been a mentor, a leader, and in many ways the soul of the show. The resignation also created a cultural ripple. For fans, it was difficult to separate the man from the puppet. Elmo's laughter had become part of childhood for millions, and suddenly that laughter carried a shadow. Some parents quietly admitted they struggled to watch the character with their children without thinking of the scandal. Others insisted that Elmo was pure, untouched by the controversy, and that the work of Sesame Street should not be diminished by the failings of a single man. In the entertainment world, Clash's departure was seen as both tragic and inevitable. The swift fall from grace underscored how quickly public figures could be undone by scandal, even when courts had yet to rule on the validity of claims. It also highlighted the unforgiving spotlight placed on those who worked with children, where even the perception of misconduct could end a career overnight. What lingered most from that November day was the silence. Clash did not hold a press conference, nor did he attempt a public defense. He simply walked away from the stage that had defined his life. Elmo's voice continued without him, the character never missing a beat, while the man behind the puppet disappeared into the background. It was a quiet end to a loud controversy and a reminder that sometimes, in the face of unrelenting pressure, resignation is the only path left. With Kevin Clash no longer at Sesame Workshop, the focus shifted from the headlines to the courts. In late 2012 and early 2013, several accusers, men who alleged they had sexual encounters with Clash when they were underage, filed civil lawsuits. These cases were not about criminal charges. Prosecutors never filed indictments. Instead, they centered on claims of emotional harm and abuse of power, accusations that were deeply damaging regardless of their legal standing. For Clash, the courtroom became the new stage. Only this time the audience was not laughing children, but lawyers, judges, and reporters scribbling every word. One of the most striking features of these lawsuits was the timing. Many of the claims described events from the 1990s or early 2000s. By the time they came forward, statutes of limitations loomed large. In some jurisdictions, individuals only had a set number of years after turning 18 to bring a case. This legal technicality became Clash's strongest defense. Even if the allegations were credible, most of them were simply too old to pursue. In 2013, a federal judge dismissed the first wave of lawsuits on those grounds. Appeals followed, but in 2014, the U.S. Court of Appeals upheld the dismissals. For Clash's attorneys, this was vindication of a sort. They could argue that their client had never been convicted of wrongdoing, that the courts had tossed the cases out. But legal victory did not erase public doubt. Headlines didn't say, "Case dismissed due to statute of limitations." They said, "Elmo puppeteer sued again." The nuance was lost in the noise, and once a reputation is bruised in the public eye, it rarely recovers fully. At the same time, the lawsuits revealed the emotional toll on the accusers. Each filing included painful details of their personal histories and their versions of encounters with Clash. Regardless of the court rulings, these men carried their stories into the public domain, often facing skepticism, scrutiny, and, in some cases, outright hostility. The legal system may have closed its doors to them, but the cultural conversation around their allegations kept echoing. Interestingly, one quirky side note emerged during this period. In one of the lawsuits, a plaintiff reportedly described meeting Clash at a social networking event for adults interested in puppetry and entertainment. It was an odd, fringe detail, but it added to the surreal nature of the case. A reminder that the puppet world, usually seen as wholesome, had its own subcultures and blurred lines between personal and professional circles. For investigators and journalists, the question lingered. Investigators still question whether the dismissals reflected true justice or merely legal loopholes. Was Clash protected by technicalities rather than innocence? Or were the accusations impossible to prove, surfacing too late to stand on solid ground? The broader public wrestled with the same dilemma. Some defended Clash, pointing to his decades of positive work and the lack of convictions. Others argued that the sheer number of accusations painted a troubling pattern. For parents, the uncertainty was unsettling. How do you reconcile the joy of a character like Elmo with the cloud hanging over the man behind the voice? As the cases wound their way through appeals and dismissals, Clash remained largely silent. He appeared occasionally at industry events and continued creative work behind the scenes, but the spotlight was gone. Instead of being celebrated as a pioneer who had reshaped children's television, he was discussed as a cautionary tale of reputation, allegations, and the unforgiving power of public opinion. Once Kevin Clash resigned and the lawsuits were filed, the media descended in full force. Every major outlet, from newspapers to online platforms, dissected the story with relentless intensity. Headlines highlighted Elmo puppeteer sued and Sesame Street star accused, often emphasizing the shocking contrast between Clash's joyful on-screen persona and the serious nature of the allegations. The mainstream fact here is that, despite no convictions, Clash's career and public image were irrevocably affected by the relentless coverage. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict in real time. The frenzy was fueled not only by the content of the allegations, but also by the human fascination with fall-from-grace stories. Clash had been seen as untouchable, a master puppeteer adored by children and praised by adults in equal measure. Suddenly, that aura of perfection was replaced by speculation, rumor, and debate. TV shows discussed the ethical responsibilities of celebrities. Parenting blogs weighed in on whether it was safe to let children watch Elmo, and online forums dissected every detail of Clash's past. The intensity was dizzying, and even for those familiar with the law, the narrative often blurred between allegation and fact. Among the media coverage, a quirky detail emerged. Some outlets analyzed the Elmo character itself, speculating whether subtle changes in voice or behavior could indicate the puppeteer's alleged personal failings. It sounds absurd, almost fringe, but it illustrated how deeply the story captured the public imagination. Suddenly, a red, furry puppet had become a proxy for a complicated human scandal. Children's laughter, once a source of pure joy, became entangled in adult controversies, highlighting the surreal intersection of innocence and media scrutiny. Investigators still question whether the rapid spread of unverified information fueled undue damage. Some journalists argued that the story needed to be reported to protect potential victims. Others countered that reporting without convictions risked destroying a life and career prematurely. The tension between journalistic duty and responsible storytelling became a central theme in discussions about Clash's case. The fallout wasn't limited to Clash himself. Sesame Workshop faced intense scrutiny, with critics questioning whether the organization had done enough to prevent misconduct and whether its investigation into the first allegation was sufficiently thorough. Sponsors and partners reevaluated relationships, and the organization had to carefully manage public relations to reassure families and the broader community. Every statement, every appearance, every press release was analyzed for hidden meaning, contributing to a persistent media storm. Meanwhile, Kevin Clash became a cautionary tale for entertainers everywhere. His decades of accomplishments, training puppeteers, creating beloved characters, mentoring others, were overshadowed by unproven allegations and the perception of scandal. Even the documentary Being Elmo, A Puppeteer's Journey, once celebrated, was now discussed in the context of controversy rather than artistry. It became an object lesson in how public perception can shift instantly, and how the spotlight that elevates can just as quickly scrutinize and consume. In homes across the world, adults grappled with conflicting emotions. How do you reconcile the joy of a childhood icon with troubling allegations against the person behind it? Some chose to separate character from creator, continuing to watch and love Elmo without pause. Others struggled to let go of the associations, worried that allowing children to engage with the character indirectly endorsed the puppeteer's alleged actions. The conversation was messy, ongoing, and deeply human, a reminder of how public scandals ripple far beyond the individual at their center. Even years later, the story of Kevin Clash remains emblematic of the collision between fame, artistry, and allegations. Media coverage may fade, but the public's memory lingers, carrying the duality of admiration and suspicion, of a man who could make millions of children smile and a scandal that reminded everyone how quickly trust can be complicated. Beyond headlines, lawsuits, and media speculation, the story of Kevin Clash reveals a more intimate truth. Allegations, proven or unproven, have a deep and lasting human cost. For Clash himself, the emotional weight of being accused in public was immense. Imagine decades of creative work suddenly overshadowed by accusations that strike at the core of personal identity and professional reputation. The silence and scrutiny were constant, a pressure unlike any puppet stage could simulate. Every performance, every public appearance, every interview became a test of composure, leaving scars that weren't visible but were profoundly real. The accusers, too, bore immense burdens. Coming forward in highly publicized cases exposes individuals to judgment, criticism, and even harassment. Each lawsuit, whether dismissed or pursued, required reliving difficult personal histories and offering testimony to strangers in formal, legal settings. Their stories, regardless of the court's rulings, became public knowledge, placing them at the center of intense scrutiny. The mainstream fact here is that civil litigation, unlike criminal cases, often leaves the evidence and narratives incomplete, which can exacerbate the emotional strain on all parties involved. A quirky but telling detail emerged in media coverage. Some journalists reported that Clash had not attended awards ceremonies or public puppetry events for months after the allegations, choosing instead to focus on private projects and personal reflection. Observers described his retreat as almost monastic, highlighting the intense personal cost of maintaining dignity while the public debate raged around him. Even in seclusion, the man who had once commanded the laughter of millions was forced to live under a microscope of speculation and judgment. Investigators still question whether public attention and media framing influence the decisions of both accusers and the legal system. Did the relentless headlines shape perceptions and behaviors, or would the lawsuits have followed the same trajectory absent media coverage? The truth is elusive. What is clear, however, is that everyone involved, Clash, the accusers, colleagues, and even Sesame Workshop staff, faced psychological and social consequences that lingered long after courtrooms closed and headlines faded. For families and children, the human toll was subtler but no less real. Parents struggled to reconcile the innocence of Elmo with the allegations against the man behind the character. Some chose to shield their children from news entirely, while others struggled to explain complex adult issues in child-friendly terms. The situation underscored the broader societal challenge of navigating scandal involving figures deeply embedded in cultural memory and childhood nostalgia. Within the entertainment community, peers expressed mixed emotions. Puppeteers who had trained under Clash lamented the loss of mentorship and camaraderie, while others acknowledged the necessity of accountability, however legally complicated. The tension highlighted a difficult ethical landscape. How do you honor years of artistic contribution while acknowledging allegations that can used to be ignored? It was a question without a simple answer, echoing in professional circles long after the lawsuits had ended. For Kevin Clash, the human toll extended to his very identity. Being a public figure in children's media meant living a life where personal missteps or allegations could not remain private. The paradox was painful. The very traits that made him a skilled puppeteer, his empathy, his ability to connect with others, were now subjected to suspicion. Each day brought reminders that reputation, once fractured, is challenging to repair, even when legal systems clear a person of wrongdoing. As you imagine this, the duality becomes palpable. The joy that Clash created through Elmo and his other characters contrasts sharply with the isolation, stress, and emotional weight of public scandal. The story is not just about allegations or career consequences. It is about the psychological ripple effect on every human being entangled in the events, a reminder that beyond the puppets and headlines are real lives shaped, sometimes scarred by circumstances beyond their control. After Kevin Clash's resignation, the world of puppetry continued, but it carried an unmistakable absence. Elmo's voice persisted, maintained by skilled performers trained under Clash's guidance, yet the essence of the original puppeteer was gone. Imagine a theater stage with one spotlight still lit, but the person who first ignited it no longer present. Children continued to watch, to laugh, to learn, but the human hands that had shaped the character for decades had withdrawn. The mainstream fact is that Sesame Workshop promptly reassigned Elmo's performances to a team of puppeteers, ensuring continuity for the show's audience while quietly closing a chapter on Clash's tenure. The quirky tidbit here is that new puppeteers had to meticulously study recordings of Clash's inflections, gestures, and timing, treating him almost as a musical score to be replicated note for note. Every blink of the puppet, every giggle, and even the subtle tilt of the head became part of an almost forensic reconstruction, a testament to Clash's skill and the difficulty of separating a performer from their creation. While the character continued, fans who were aware of the change often reported that something felt different, a tiny emotional inflection or subtle timing shift that reminded them Elmo's original voice had vanished. Investigators and industry insiders still question whether the long-term impact on puppetry culture has been fully acknowledged. Losing a central figure like Clash affected training pipelines, mentorship, and even public perception of the art form. Younger puppeteers who had admired him closely now had to navigate a profession that suddenly felt fraught with moral ambiguity and cautionary tales. For many, it was a reminder that a career built on public trust can be both fragile and profoundly influential. The absence of Clash also emphasized the duality of Elmo's legacy. While the character remained beloved, the man who brought him to life was now a figure of controversy. Parents, educators, and fans faced a nuanced reality. They could continue to celebrate Elmo without endorsing the individual behind the voice. In this way, puppetry itself became a lesson in separating artistry from human imperfection, a skill rarely taught outside of performing arts circles. Even beyond Sesame Street, the ripple effect was evident. Educational programs, toy companies, and family entertainment ventures observed the story closely, reevaluating policies around employee conduct and public accountability. The Clash case became a reference point in discussions about ethics, boundaries, and the protection of minors in creative industries. While Elmo's giggle remained unchanged, the conversation about who wields power behind the scenes had been permanently transformed. For Clash personally, this period marked a quiet, almost invisible chapter. He continued creative work, sometimes collaborating with puppetry projects outside mainstream media, but the spotlight no longer shone. The human desire for recognition collided with the reality of lost public trust, and even decades of groundbreaking work could not fully erase the shadow cast by allegations. As you imagine Elmo continuing to laugh and play on screens worldwide, it's striking to consider how the absence of one individual's artistry can leave a subtle, almost imperceptible gap. Puppetry, a craft built on empathy, precision, and the magic of hiding behind a character, now carried a reminder of vulnerability, reputation, and consequence. Even without a headline, the art form itself had been reshaped, leaving audiences with joy in one hand and complexity in the other. The story of Kevin Clash, like the giggle of Elmo, continues to echo long after the headlines fade. You can almost hear it in quiet moments, a reminder that even the brightest talents are not immune to controversy, and that public perception often lingers longer than truth. Clash's career reminds us that influence carries immense responsibility, and that the very qualities which make someone extraordinary, creativity, empathy, connection, can become complicated in the shadow of allegations, no matter how legally unresolved. For audiences, the takeaway is nuanced. Children still laugh with Elmo, parents still guide their learning, and the joy of puppetry persists. Yet, adults carry an understanding that the story behind the curtain is layered, imperfect, and human. This duality, joy and caution, innocence and scrutiny, is part of the ongoing legacy. It invites reflection on how we separate art from the artist, how we weigh accomplishments against accusations, and how trust is both built and fractured over time. For Kevin Clash himself, the journey has been one of private reflection and cautious public presence. Away from the relentless glare of media scrutiny, he continues to create, to mentor, and to contribute to puppetry in ways that may never reach the same scale of fame. The art he shaped lives on, a testament to skill, imagination, and dedication, while the controversy remains a permanent chapter in his story. Ultimately, the tale of Kevin Clash is not only about allegations, resignation, or legal battles. It is about the complex intersection of talent, fame, and human fallibility. It is about the paradox of influence, how one man can bring immeasurable joy to millions while simultaneously facing the enduring consequences of unresolved accusations. In the end, the legacy is both luminous and shadowed, a reminder that behind every character we love, a real, complicated human story may be quietly unfolding.